Hi, everyone. Want to take a seat? We're going to get started. Welcome to this panel this afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I am your moderator. My name is Sam Roosh. I'm the Executive Director of Apathy is Boring, and I'm here on behalf of Elections BC to present these three experts on polarization, and we're really excited to dive in. So the way this session is going to work is I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then each of our panelists is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions on the floor. And if you guys don't have any questions, I do. So I hope that's all right. Basically, today, the subject of our panel is polarization, which obviously has been a major theme for the day so far today. But I've been tasked with sharing with all of you sort of an operating definition that we're going to be working off of for the purposes of this panel. So technically speaking, political polarization is the widening and hardening differences of attitudes and opinions in the political spectrum. It can be organic or elevated through disinformation and other activities, and is often heightened by social media engagement. What we mean by that is that what we're really seeing right now is an increasingly entrenched us versus them or affective polarization that extends beyond the political arena and is affecting individuals' social capital or the number of social relationships that they hold outside of their in-group as people start self-sorting along specific lines. And polarization can form across any number of cleavages. This definition is ever expanding beyond political polarization to include other types of othering that can happen. For example, sports teams, regional, urban versus rural, etc. So today we're very fortunate to be joined by three experts, and they're here to share their work with us. Each presenter will take about 10 minutes, as I said, and then we'll have this short discussion. Up first, we have Anton Bogman. Anton was appointed as the Chief Electoral Officer of British Columbia on June 1st, 2018, and served as an Electoral Boundaries Commissioner from October 2021 to April 2023. A planning expert and acknowledged as innovative and passionate about elections, Bogman's focus has been improving accessibility to voting and enhancing electoral services. He played a senior leadership role in the past 5 provincial general elections, 4 referenda, and 12 provincial by-elections. Prior to joining Elections BC, Bogman served 7 years as an officer with the Royal Canadian Navy. He was also part of the initial startup administration at Royal Roads University and worked as a technology project manager and privately as a management consultant. He graduated from the Royal Military College of Canada in 1988 with a Bachelor of Arts and obtained a Master's of Business Administration from Athabasca University in 2021. He is also a certified project management professional. So let's welcome Anton. We'll start with panel with him.
So thanks very much for the introduction. I'd forgotten how long my short bio drones on for, so maybe I'll have to work on that. Really happy to be here and happy to be speaking about this topic. We've been told we have 10 minutes, so I've cut back to, I think, only 7 slides now, so I've got a little bit over a minute per slide. The topic that I'm presenting and the aspect that I'm presenting on, which is really that of an election management body, an election administrator, will reinforce some of the themes that Stéphane Perrault presented at this morning's opening keynote, but provide a little bit more detail about some of the surveys that he mentioned around trust and hopefully dig into some of the other aspects in a little bit more detail. And then, of course, we're hoping to have lots of time for questions, so welcome those questions from audience after the end. I'm going to talk about kind of 3 things. One is just about why we care about polarization. I think that's important. We all care about it, but what's unique in terms of election management bodies? The second part is just about what the state of trust is in Canadian elections. And Stéphane mentioned relatively high levels of trust that we're seeing for election management bodies. So I'll show a couple of survey slides that speak to that and where that's at. And then I'm going to be speaking a little bit about what we can do as election management bodies to address trust. And I think it's important that people who are engaged in this community and who are interested in the topics of polarization and trust know that not only there's lots of great work that nonprofits are doing, but it's an issue that's recognized by election management bodies, and it's one that we're taking active steps to try to address some of the deficit. So why do we care about polarization? Why do election management bodies care about polarization? Well, our concerns in this area primarily are about those aspects of polarization that could reduce trust in elections. And if a public if their views about the administration of election, if the voters' views, the electorate's views become polarized, then it poses, I believe, a serious and ongoing risk to trust and therefore to our democracy. If one side of the political spectrum has a favorable view on trust, has positive views of election administration, but if the other side of that political spectrum has negative views, then of course, even the activities of an independent, nonpartisan election management body can be viewed through that polarized lens, right? Because one's viewing it in one area, one's viewing it from another perspective. And even if it's just kind of that one side of the perspective, the overall result net is going to be that there's going to be a reduction in trust overall in terms of elections. So that's why we care about it. If you look at polarization and trust, and there's a clear link between the two. And when we talk about trust and elections, you're talking about, is the process fair? Have the results been reported accurately? The levels of trust then become a measure of the perceived legitimacy of that election, of the outcome of that election. And if the voters trust elections, they'll believe that the results were reported accurately. They'll believe in general that the election was a fair contest between participants, and then that the elected government has a mandate to govern. I think there's also, well, there is specific research that supports the fact that high levels of trust, they also encourage voter participation, voter turnout, as well as a willingness to abide by government decisions and an overall sense of satisfaction with the democratic process that they've just been through. Voters who trust elections, have a high level of trust in elections, are also less susceptible to disinformation that may be designed to undermine the legitimacy of that election. I think if you look at the flip side, then voters with lower trust in elections, that can be lower trust about the process, or it can be lower levels of trust about the outcome. And some people start off by not trusting the process, hence they don't trust the outcome. Others may start off by not trusting the outcome, which then leads them to question parts of that process. Just as higher levels of trust support higher levels of participation and higher levels of engagement, lower levels of trust are evidenced in lower levels of democratic participation and voter turnout, and may also result in lower interest in government decisions and lower levels of dissatisfaction with that democratic process. I think a key takeaway that we have learned is that lower levels of trust, they can cause electors to pursue non-democratic means of achieving policy goals, which really speaks to the breakdown, in essence, of a democracy. And we certainly saw that south of the border with the July 6th attack on the Capitol in the US following their recent presidential election in 2020. But I think closer to home, you see that in aspects of some of the objectives that were put out by the Freedom Convoy in their descent upon Ottawa, and demands to meet with the Governor General and to remove the elected Prime Minister. So what does some of the data say about trust? So if you look at the National Electors Survey, this is taken from 2021, done by CDEM and funded by Elections Canada. And this looks at perceptions given the context of the federal election between August and October of 2021. You can see that on the whole, there are very high levels of trust. Key findings of that, there's 87% have the perception that the election was run either very fairly or somewhat fairly, with the largest group, 70%, saying that the election was done fairly. The work that CDEM has done on this points to the fact that although the survey is done at a national level, it's also respective of the similar types of results provincially. So you break it down provincially and you note that there are similar levels of trust with provincial election management bodies. Drilling down a little bit lower, you can see that there's also a very high perception about the accuracy of election results. So in this case, 91%, of which 72% was very high and 18% somewhat high, had trust that the results of the election were accurate. It reinforces this theme that Mr. Perot mentioned earlier this morning, that trust in election administrators and trust in the process in Canada is at a generally high level. But echoing the point from this morning, we can't take that for granted as election administrators. And I think all Canadian election management bodies are quite concerned about the potential negative impact on trust levels and have been developing ways to address this. I think to understand the trust environment and therefore what strategies might be effective in bolstering trust, it's important to consider that the performance of an election management body in administering an election is only one aspect to this. And while the performance of the election management body can work to support trust levels, the truth is that, unfortunately, there are likely many more aspects that are outside the control of election management body that can potentially influence trust to a greater level of degree. I think the average voter interacts with an election agency likely only during an election. And in fact, we wish more would interact with elections agencies during elections. But the other factors extend on an ongoing basis and are in fact becoming pervasive. There's a saying amongst election administrators is that there's no longer just a single limited campaign period around an election. It's really become the permanent campaign. And that's more of a factor of Canadian political life, where as soon as the writs are returned and government is formed after one election, the campaigning starts for the next one. So some of these factors, of course, are political narratives. I think it's important that if you see politicians and political actors pushing disinformation to their supporters, this is, of course, going to have a negative view on trust in election results. And the types, it's not only the type of information or disinformation that's pushed, it's also who's doing that pushing. The narratives will have a higher profile or more legitimacy in the eyes of the supporters if they're coming from major party candidates. Certainly this has been true in the US since 2016. We also saw it occurring in Brazil in their 2020 election when one of the candidates, Bolsonaro, pushed disinformation about electronic voting machines. So it was quite significant. I think the media environment is also a factor. Again, I'm drawing for lots of examples south of the border because it just seems like there's so much that's impacting polarization and trust down there. But a polarized media landscape can exacerbate political divisions and can exacerbate distrust in electoral process. Again, in US, following their 2020 election, Fox News played a major role in publishing and pushing election disinformation to a broad audience. And then we've seen, of course, the recent settlement in a lawsuit with Dominion Voting Services, where they acknowledged that they knew that this was disinformation and baseless. I think election laws, which vary, of course, across Canada, you would think that with only 14 jurisdictions, we'd have a lot more similarity in our election law. And while on the whole, I think it's recognizable across jurisdiction in Canada, there are specific differences and there are nuances, and it's not a one-size-fits-all model. So election laws can impact perceptions of fairness and trust in elections. And they can impact how inclusive voters feel about being part of that process. Did a law prevent a smaller party, for example, having the same exposure that a major party had? Did it prevent candidates from running? Were there barriers to participation from a candidate perspective? Were campaign finance laws, were they even across the board? Did they restrict contributions? Did they have fair spending limits, things like that? Was money an undue influence? Or were the electoral boundaries set up in a fair way? And I think by and large, the Canadian version of boundary setting is neutral and nonpartisan, as opposed to what you see where it's controlled by some state legislatures south of the border. Foreign disinformation campaigns, of course, this has been in the media almost nonstop since probably February. Is that right, Stefan, when it first arose? Well before that. So foreign disinformation, of course, can impact perceptions of fairness and in extreme cases could impact perceptions of legitimacy of the result. I think it's also not known that, or rather I should say it is known that for many foreign actors who are trying to put their disinformation into the Canadian space, one of their avowed goals is to sow distrust, to increase levels of participation, and to discredit the entire democratic process. I think there's some bias in there. We've seen some research that suggests that if a voter's preferred candidate won, then they're more likely to have trust in the outcome, whereas if their candidate didn't win, they didn't. And then personal social networks. I think these sorts of things are where if your networks are providing a certain sphere or a certain lens to look at things through, you tend to be more trustful of that. So very short, quickly, just to move on to what are some of the things that we can do. There's a number of concrete actions. I think many of us are taking a more proactive stance towards trust and what we need to do to maintain trust. A lot of us have developed trust strategies, including tactics like pre-bunking myths or creating truth sandwiches where you say the truth, then you say the myth, and then you reinforce with more facts about the truth. Also, looking internationally for best practices. International Idea, a think tank on elections out of Stockholm, has come up with what they call the 4 pillars of trust. Trust of delivery, which really speaks to voters are more likely to trust the results if the delivery is smooth and the election officials are competent. Trust of engagement, which speaks to how an election management body communicates, not only before the election, but also do issues or crises emerge during the election. How do they respond to that? Is it done in a transparent way? Trust of familiarity. Stefan spoke to this morning about if you're familiar with the process, you are more likely to trust it, which places a greater emphasis on election management bodies if you're introducing new processes to really go over and above in terms of communicating about that. And then trust of integrity, which just means that's how election management bodies need to act and be perceived to be acting. We can also look at making recommendations for legislative change. That's one area where many of us have been proactive in. And BC, we were recently fortunate to see some legislative change based on recommendations we've put forward in the area of preventing disinformation in elections. And lastly, we need to do a lot of things both on our own, but also in collaboration with other election management bodies and other stakeholders that we have. So I'll leave my comments there and pass it over back to Sam.
Thank you, Anton. So up next, we have Laura Stevenson. Laura Stevenson is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Western University. Stevenson specializes in Canadian and comparative political behavior and elections. Her research focuses on understanding how institutions and context influence attitudes, electoral preferences, and engagement with politics. In addition, directing the Center for the Study of Political Behavior at Western, Stevenson is co-director of the Consortium on Electoral Democracy, also known as CEDEM. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks. And thanks very much to Elections BC for organizing today. So I'm going to take you through slides, probably about the same number as Anton had, but I'm going to focus a little bit more specifically on polarization and institutional confidence drawing on the definition that Sam provided for us, right? So if polarization means the separation or the widening of attitudes and the hardening of attitudes, how should we be thinking about that when we look at what's going on in today's society, and does it have any implications? So 3 questions. Number 1, do Canadians perceive polarization? And I will tell you that perceived polarization is probably even more important than whether or not it actually exists, okay? Because it can have implications that way. Number 2, are partisans themselves actually seeing themselves being further apart? Okay, so Canadians in general have attitudes, which is one thing, right? We see things happening. But what about partisans in terms of how they see themselves compared to others? And then finally, what does this mean for institutional confidence, or what might it mean? Oh, where did my pretty little, okay, well, this just looks like a big blob. Hold on. I will read you what it's supposed to say. I'm not really sure how that happened. So we ran some questions thanks to a wonderful postdoc at the University of Toronto who has done some work with CDAM. Her name was Sarah Lachance, and she's really interested in polarization. So I'm giving her credit because she pushed us to talk about this. So the red blob is representing 53% of Canadians who took our study in May of 2023. And what we asked them to do was to choose between 2 options. First, most parties offer middle of the road positions that satisfy most Canadians, or most parties offer distinct positions on issues that best represent the preferences of their supporters. So way back when, Canadian political parties were referred to as Tweedledee and Tweedledum. That would be the red part. The yellow part is the alternative. And what you can see is very close to being split. Okay, so there's some interest, some inclination that people are seeing parties as being a little more similar that way. However, when we asked some more specific questions about what people were seeing in society, we get a little bit of a different look. So the first thing, you can see the first set of bars, today's political parties disagree more about the right direction for the country than in the past. 75% are agreeing. Parties are just as likely to compromise with each other today as in the past. That's only 51% agreeing with that. Politicians are taking more extreme positions than they have in the past. 73% agree with that. And elected politicians are willing to work across the cross-party lines. Only 40% agree. So in terms of people perceiving polarization and the parties as being more and more different, there's some inclination or inkling that in fact that may be occurring. Now, what about where do the partisans see themselves in general? So what we have here are my beautiful colored dots. These represent partisans, so people who say that they think about themselves as a supporter of one of the political parties, and it's where they place themselves ideologically. So the scale goes from 0 to 10, and what you can see is that it's very clearly distinct as to where most of the parties are. So the top line are Liberal partisans. They see themselves, not surprisingly, centrist, right? The NDP as being left of center. I'm probably doing this right. Oh, no, I'm doing it right. And the Conservatives being much further to the right. When you look at the Conservative partisans, you see they're putting the NDP and the Liberal parties very, very similarly in terms of where they think they are. And then their own party even further to the right than the Liberals are putting them. And when it comes to the NDP, NDP partisans see differences between their party and the Liberals, but they also push the Conservatives even further to the right. So if we're talking about, do partisans perceive differences amongst the parties? Do they see polarization? The answer would be yes. And in fact, probably most especially so for Conservative partisans. And it's that mixing of the Liberals and the NDP that I find most interesting in that sense, right? So Conservatives are really seeing an us versus them dynamic in society. So what does this mean exactly? Right? That's the next thing to think about. Well, earlier today, Allison, my colleague, had some great comments about what we're kind of seeing in society, and it's the attitudes that people are holding about others, right? Do they see them as similar? That might be the most important. And so there's this term we talk about called affective polarization. And that basically means how much do you like your own party uh, more than you like the other party? So how big is that difference? Okay. So it's a lot. Okay, if the scale is from 0 to 50, we have the mean is about halfway. So people do have a good amount of polarization in terms of their own attitudes. But does it have implications for confidence is what we're caring about here. So what I've got here is, again, I'm dividing up by conservative partisans, liberal partisans, and NDP partisans, and I'm looking across the scale. So as someone becomes more affectively polarized, meaning they like their party more than the other parties, okay, to a greater extent, what does that do for their confidence in institutions? And here I'm just looking at the federal government in 3 different time periods. We've got 2019, 2021, and 2023, okay? And what you can see is probably what you'd expect of partisans with a liberal government. So this isn't all that surprising, right? Because I'm talking specifically about the federal government here. And not surprisingly, liberals who like the liberals more than anyone else are more confident in the government, which happens to be a liberal government right now and is through these 3 time periods. And conservatives go the opposite way. Also not all that surprising. What is interesting, if you compare 2019 and compared to 2021 and 2023, the NDP has a slightly more positive bent, not really significant there, probably representing the confidence agreement that they have right now, which is kind of interesting. So this is what we would expect. Okay, this doesn't worry me at all when we're talking about institutional confidence, because I would expect that partisan attitudes are going to be strong when we talk about parties and government. Okay, that makes sense. What I think we need to pay more attention to is what's shown here on these graphs. So the top one is just confidence in the government again, 2023. So that's what you've seen. But the others are nonpartisan institutions. So I've got the courts, I've got the media, and I've got Elections Canada. So I'm not like, sounding the alarm, dialing 911 at this point, because these aren't quite as stark, right, patterns for the nonpartisan institutions. But I think what we do see is that there is something going on, that conservatives who are more affectively polarized, in fact, are carrying that over to other kinds of institutions. And this includes the media too, which you can't even say that's a bureaucratic arm of government, right? So this is just a general kind of, it's not really an anger, but a distrust in other institutions in society. And this is something that I think is part of like that overall what's going on right now that we need to be thinking about. This is where we were coming from. So this is part of a bigger project that I'm going to be working on with Andrea Lawler, who is going to be of Master University, looking at this kind of confidence. Because this is where we really want to pay attention to what's going on in terms of dividing society. Again, it's not necessarily that the people hold different views, but if they are perceiving that the parties are all that different, and in fact, the parties are being placed differently, then that's creating cues for how people are internalizing and thinking about politics. And in this case, it has a lot to do also with the messages that are being put forward by the elites associated with those parties, because we do know that party cues matter a lot for people's views. So one last piece to show you. This has to do a question about safe from foreign interference, obviously very timely for what's going on right now. Also, of course, with the recent resignation, what's going to happen next. And you'll see that beliefs about how confident you are that our elections are safe from foreign interference are, again, very much influenced by people's degree of affective polarization in a terribly partisan manner. And I say terribly because this part concerns me, right? Because elections should serve all parties. But now we're seeing this kind of spillover in a different manner. And this is something that I guess I'm a little bit more worried about. On the other hand, I do think that it's great that everyone's here. So maybe we can figure out ways to kind of counter it a little bit before things get too out of hand. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. And finally, last but not least, we have Michael Powell. Michael is a professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa, where he researches and teaches constitutional law and election law. He is the author of over 28 academic articles and is co-editor of the Cyber Threats to Canadian Democracy, McGill Queens, which was one of the Hill Times' books of the year for 2022. He was a commissioner with the Far North Electoral Boundaries Commission for Ontario and acted as external legal advisor to the Ministry of the Attorney General for Ontario's 2017 campaign finance reforms. His article on the unwritten principle of democracy and constitutional interpretation was recently cited by the Supreme Court of Canada in City of Toronto v. Ontario. He is currently at work on a book on the constitutional politics of election commissions around the world. Welcome, Michael. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the very kind introduction, Sam, and a real pleasure to be here. Thanks to all the organizers and to Elections BC. So you've heard from the perspective of an electoral management body and the quantitative data from Professor Stevenson. So what I wanted to do was, from the point of view of the legal framework that establishes and administers elections and the constitutional framework around democratic rights, take you through what I see as 4 really big picture challenges around trust and elections in Canada at the moment, and then just briefly talk about some of the responses that we've started to make to try to counteract the negative aspects of some of those challenges. So the first challenge, these won't be shock to anybody having wanting to be in the room in the first place, then having listened to some of the other presentations. So first one being misinformation and disinformation. The second challenge is around social media platform governance. The third, much in the news these days, foreign interference and elections. And then the last is on trust in relation to the data that flows through our political system these days, especially in relation to political parties. And then I'll say a couple things quickly about responses, including legal prohibitions, expanding the jurisdiction or authority of electoral management bodies into things like nomination contests, and then a couple questions about national security involvement. So misinformation and disinformation. So disinformation has always been a part of Canadian elections. Okay, in many of the Canadian jurisdictions, there's long been a prohibition on falsely claiming that a candidate has dropped out of the race. Okay, that's because one of the most common forms of early misinformation, disinformation, was to claim your opponent wasn't running anymore. Pre-internet, right? That was an easy lie to spread. So we can't. So what's changed is the scale and the speed, right? Not the fact of mis or disinformation. So I think we do ourselves a disservice if we think of this as a totally new phenomenon. Okay, and so the charter comes in here. So I'm not advocating this, okay? But one way to deal with disinformation is simply to ban it, right? And send people to jail for spreading disinformation, okay? The charter, I think properly, protects freedom of political expression, okay? And the Supreme Court of Canada has on multiple occasions said that protects even lies deliberately told, okay? And political expression is at the core of the guarantee of the charter. So any policy response that we want to have to misinformation or disinformation has to have that constitutional reality as the starting point. Right? And so what we see in federal legislation and in some of the provinces is an attempt to have very narrow provisions that deal with deliberate lies told either about candidates, okay, or about the electoral process itself. Okay, and so lies about how Elections Canada operates, for example, impersonating an election officer, lies about specific, narrow, provable facts about candidates, right? What their occupation is. Do they have a criminal record? Okay, so those are things that have been prohibited, telling disinformation about those specific items. So we've tried to take a very narrow slice of the disinformation problem and solve it by essentially banning it, okay? Is that effective or not, right? That's something that we are still wrestling with. So we are kind of chipping away at the edges of the disinformation problem in light of that constitutional reality. And so the big change from when started, it's a long problem, but when we really started kind of collectively taking this seriously, 2016 and onwards, the really big change is the big lie, right? That the electoral system itself is the target of disinformation, not just the candidates and the parties. And so we do see that in Canada. We obviously saw it in the United States, and it's something that we're gonna have to keep on trying to grapple with, those specific targeted disinformation tactics aimed at the electoral process or system. Okay. Next big challenge is around social media, related obviously to misinformation and disinformation because it's often spread on social media. And so I think there's two points I want to make about social media. The first is around advertising. So the thing that social media dramatically changed in the political environment was the ability to engage in micro-targeted advertising. Okay, so if a party runs an ad on a hockey night in Canada, right, they're targeting a certain demographic, but we all get to see what's in the ad. Okay, it's public. Okay, micro-targeting means you can send an ad at a specific group, a specific individual, could be based on demographic data, could be based on geography, okay? And it's not necessarily seen by the rest of the public, okay? And that could have incentives for how inflammatory you want that message to be, for example, okay? Has implications for whether we can have a collective conversation as voters, okay? But micro-targeting really dramatically changes the media environment. And so the response to that was in the Elections Modernization Act federally to have an ad repository. Okay, so ads that were micro-targeted that we wouldn't otherwise see, each social media platform above a certain size has to keep a copy of that ad and some information about the source of the advertisement and maybe who it reached. Okay, and so but the ad repository only applies in a narrow defined time period where they're actually required to keep political ads up. Anton mentioned the 24/7, 365 permanent campaign. Okay, and so we've introduced an element of publicity to the system of micro-targeting, but we haven't actually gotten at most of the political communication that's happening throughout most of the year in most years outside of election time. Okay, so social media platforms have changed how advertising communication happens, which has impacts on how much trust individuals might potentially have in the system, partly because we don't know what's going on. We can't see it. Next big challenge is around foreign interference, been in the news quite a bit. I'll also say not a new thing, has been going on for a long time, and always worth reminding ourselves that some of the longest, most established democracies have themselves engaged in foreign interference in other elections. So it's a very prevalent phenomenon. Okay, and so two big points, okay, around foreign interference. With the reemergence of an awareness around the vulnerabilities of the Canadian system to foreign interference over the last number of years, okay, we see an increasing involvement of the national security apparatus in elections, okay? Mostly through the history of democracy, what we've tried to do is separate, right? Separate the military from civilian elections, separate national security from elections. And what we see though is now is a kind of bringing back in of those two different spheres. And so leaks to the press from national security agencies, politicians under surveillance, those are now features of national politics that we have to deal with that have impacts on trust that I think we're still that we're still trying to see. So Sam mentioned the book on election cybersecurity that we had that came out recently. Professor Lisa Young, University of Calgary, has a great chapter talking about all the unknowns that are coming out because of the involvement of national security in Canadian elections now. The other a big issue to highlight under foreign interference that relates to trust is around this issue that obviously came to prominence in the US, how and when and who might announce foreign interference that it is happening if it's in the middle of the election. Okay, and so the federal response was to create a panel, okay, that operates according to a protocol, a panel of senior civil servants that would be the ones to make a decision whether we as a public should be informed there is foreign interference. Okay, and there's two facts that sit kind of uncomfortably together. One is that we know foreign interference is happening. Academic reports, journalistic reports, reports of the Canadian security establishment, right, all say foreign interference is happening in elections. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, this panel that was constituted and has been in place for a couple of elections has never actually announced, right, never said the threshold was met to announce to the Canadian public that foreign interference was happening in the middle of the election. And so there's a lack of clarity in my mind about the standard that is applied by the panel and the standard that we need to have a discussion about the standard that should be applied. Okay, is it if the result of an election and a riding would be changed by the foreign interference? Does it have to be a number of ridings? Does it have to be a legal activity? So we just don't know what particular threshold is used. And I think we need to have a public conversation about what the best threshold would be so that Canadians have confidence that there is an announcement in the middle of the election about foreign interference, why it's happening, and what the considerations are. So just lastly, on trust and data, okay? So data is, I mean, money is the currency of political parties, but data is also the currency of political parties. I won't take you through all the details, but people are usually shocked if you tell them how much information the parties have about all of us in the room, because they engage in targeted gathering of information and then use that to shape their communications, fundraising, and so on. And so there are no meaningful privacy laws that restrain what federal political parties can do in terms of the collecting of data and the use of data, apart from some very narrow things in the Elections Act around using the voters list and things like that. And so Quebec has some legislation provincially, so does British Columbia. But as I try unsuccessfully to tell the parties in Ottawa, what would the effect on trust be if there is a large hack of a political party database and the sensitive private information of Canadians is posted on the internet for all to see? Okay, version of that happened in France. Okay, political parties have been hacked in Australia and the Australian legislature. So these are not kind of fanciful concerns, but the lack of privacy protection and the lack of kind of cybersecurity requirements that exist on parties can have potentially very significant consequences for the trust that Canadians have in elections and the parties that compete for political power. So I'll leave it there and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks.
Michael. Okay, I believe we have about 6 minutes. No extension? No? Okay. I thought I tried. So I want to give you folks a chance to ask some questions. So if anyone has one, if you could put your hand up. Diana has a microphone. But in the time while Diana's walking, I had actually a quick question for you, Laura, and if anyone else wants to jump in. But you talk about in your data the political partisanship and how that impacts polarization. But I'm curious, given that young people, for example, are substantially less partisan, so to speak, as perhaps older generations are, how are you measuring that polarization in other ways? Are there other structures you're looking at as well, or just the sort of party affiliation level?
So the way we've measured polarization, it doesn't depend on whether they're partisans. I just showed you how it works for the partisans, but it's basically just how people say they feel towards the parties in general. I think the key thing is again the perceptions of polarization that people are seeing, because even if the views are shared, the issue is whether or not young people or older people or anybody is seeing that the parties are very different. Right, because when you see polarization, it can have impacts on creating the us versus them dynamic. So even if it doesn't exist, you start to believe it exists, and then that can have the spillover effects.
And then that can lead to further polarization along those different points. Very interesting. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
I have well, two questions if we can get to them. First, from an enforcement perspective, for the measures that currently exist under elections acts across the country, um, do you think that there is enough there for election officials to monitor ongoing on social media platforms the spreading of mis and disinformation, and if so, their ability to deal with the platforms to help take it down or correct that information? And then the second question might be more for Professor Powell about the legal context, some of the Supreme Court decisions that you mentioned. I think a long prevailing view has been, well, good speech can flood out the bad speech. Do you think we're at a point though where more needs to be done to crack down on the bad speech?
I guess so. I'll address the first question very briefly. I think that I don't think that all legislation is fit for purpose, shall we say, in terms of addressing what the risk is. Obviously, there's many other CEOs here, several other ones, and they can speak more knowledgeably about their jurisdiction than I can. But in reading recommendations, reports that many of them have put out, I think that supports my position that there are gaps, and that part of the answer is definitely in the hands of legislators there. In terms of the ability to take that legislation and enforce it, I think again there's a range of sizes of election management bodies across Canada, a range of capacities that are available. Obviously, Elections Canada has a very different capacity picture than Elections Yukon, as an example. So one of the ways we're looking at bridging that is through sharing of resources. I know even in the last municipal elections in British Columbia, my office and Elections Canada had a partnership to share. I shared their resources in terms of foreign language monitoring of social media and other media. So there's ways that we can work together to be able to share resources, certainly share best practices. But overall, I would say that there is a gap in legislation as reflected in our recommendations reports, and we're trying to find ways that we can have the necessary capacity to do the necessary monitoring.
We have robust protection of political expression in the charter. That's a good thing. It does mean that some of the legislation that's been in place in, say, Germany or New Zealand around some of the kind of takedown of illegal information online, we just simply cannot do. So I think that's just, I don't think that's going to change. Can there be changes in, say, the doctrines that courts use to acknowledge the harm that is done by misinformation and actually go into the analysis of whether it's justified under the charter to limit that kind of speech? I think there is some room there, but the courts have been still pretty strict. There's a recent CCF case where part of the Federal Elections Act was struck down. That was part of the restrictions on what you can say, disinformation about candidates. Parliament amended the law, and so it's now, we'll see if there's another challenge to it, but I think there is some potential change we could have in the doctrine to recognize that disinformation is now, it's an industry, right? People are doing it for money, and it's now a constant feature of elections, not an incidental thing. And so how does the media environment, how does the political environment deal with that? It's part of that conversation.
We've got about 1 minute left if anyone has a final quick question. No? Oh, go ahead.
Just wanted to pick up on what Laura was saying earlier about just perceptions of differences. And I really found this striking in my role as a boundary commissioner. I traveled extensively throughout British Columbia talking. I think we visited 40 to 50 communities, traveled, I think, 250,000 kilometers to talk to people. And my one takeaway from that was I wish I could get everybody who came to speak to our commission, which ranged from over 200 people in Dawson Creek to probably, I think there was maybe 2 people in Chilliwack that showed up, or not Chilliwack and Hope that showed up to speak to us. But get everybody into one big room and have them make the same presentations they made to us, to each other. And we find that certainly my takeaway was British Columbians are way more similar than they think they're different, yet their perceptions were so strikingly vivid that the people in the Lower Mainland, the Vancouver elites, as they were called, are so different than the people who live in the Peace region. But they're all interested in the economy and being able to make a living, in a healthcare system for them, whether it's lack of doctors in the north as opposed to inability to get a doctor in the densely populated urban areas. They're all concerned about education for their families, about transportation. My takeaway is people are much more similar than they're different, but it's the perceptions that seems to drive it.
Absolutely. And I think that ties in really beautifully to a big theme I think that's emerging today around listening. And I think it's such an important, crucial skill that we could all practice, of course, a little more regularly. I want to thank Elections BC and our wonderful panelists. Please give them a round of applause. Laura, Michael, Anton, thank you so much. And thank you for being here.